Welcome back. In this video, we'll be discussing and defining intertextuality and explaining how that relates back to the three previous terms we discussed, those being text, subtext, and context, and also explaining how all of these different terms relate and how they inform our understanding of literary analysis. So to review what we covered in the previous video, we have text, subtext, and context. Text refers to anything that can be read or analyzed. In the context of literary analysis, we can think of that as being a novel, a short story, any literary text. But again, a text does not have to be written. It can also be visual, musical, etc. Subtext is what is underneath the surface of the text. And we can think of this as the underlying message or implicit meaning. Recall that implicit refers to something that is not communicated directly, whereas explicit is something that is communicated directly. So if we have the scenario where, for example, someone tells another person, I would love to go have lunch with you, but that person is actually shaking his or her head as they're saying that. The explicit communication is that they do want to go to lunch, they're enthusiastic, but what they're implicitly communicating, and the implicit communication is usually that which is more honest and accurate, is that they don't want to go. So you can have two different messages being communicated at once. The implicit message is usually the one that is accurate. Sarcasm is also another good example of this. Someone says something, but the tone and inflection that they use suggests that they mean the opposite of what they're actually saying. That's verbal sarcasm. And then finally, we have context. Context refers to the factors that inform the text. So we can think of this as the time period in which the text was written, the upbringing of the author's religious, political, social beliefs, and so on. Anything that contributed to the creation of the text would be an example of context. We can also include in here literary movements and artistic movements that contributed to the text style and to its priorities. All right, so now we should have a clear understanding of text and subtext. Let's discuss intertextuality and how that relates to literary analysis. So we've established that context refers to the factors and other influences that inform the creation of the text. But it's obvious that text can be factors that influence other texts. And as most everything is a text, it's inevitable that texts will influence one another. This is essentially what we mean by intertextuality, the relationship, explicit and implicit, between texts. So let's define that. Intertextuality. And again, the prefix gives it away. Inter refers to relationship between texts. This is not wholly complicated or sophisticated, but it is important to keep in mind that when we approach literary analysis, and again, if we are not subscribing to a particular critical theory or literary theory, such as formalism, for example, then what we are doing is taking into account all of the different contextual factors that influence the creation of a text. This means also considering how texts are influenced by other texts. In the case of literary analysis, this usually looks like the influence another author might have on his or her contemporaries or successors. So for instance, Cormac McCarthy, very popular, successful American writer, is highly influenced by William Faulkner. In McCarthy's earlier novels, especially, there is evidence of Faulkner's influence. So we can see a stylistic kind of inheritance as a result of one author's exposure to another author's texts. This becomes important in the case of literary analysis, because then we can consider the ways that those earlier texts inform and mold what comes after them. All right, let's take another example. So that was a case of fiction, but let's think about how intertextuality can also affect speeches and essays. And we'll use some pivotal texts throughout American history to illustrate this. Let's start with perhaps the most influential of all American texts, this being the American Declaration of Independence. So Declaration of Independence was published in 1776. So that would be late 1700s, late 18th century. Declaration of Independence influences the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, which, if I'm not mistaken, was 1863. Okay, Lincoln refers back to the Declaration of Independence. He makes textual references to this. Both of these texts influence Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, which is actually 100 years later in 1963. King makes references, allusions, historical allusions to Lincoln. He makes allusions also to the Declaration of Independence. So you can see a connection from one text to the next, a kind of, again, ancestry that can be traced back. And of course, we understand the Declaration of Independence to be influenced also by the English philosopher John Locke. So John Locke, I believe in his two treatises on government, talks about, forget if he calls them inalienable rights at the time, I think he might, life, liberty, and property, and then Jefferson takes those in the Declaration of Independence and morphs them into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Gettysburg Address and I Have a Dream refer to the promise of all men being created equal. In the I Have a Dream speech, we get a reflection on the progress of the American experience, the American project, and whether the promise of the Declaration of Independence, the value that it held fast that all men are created equal, is that actually being realized by the United States of the 1960s. And of course, King's point is that it is not. And so then King uses a variety of other metaphors throughout his speech to illustrate his meaning, right? His implicit subtext. So intertextuality can be thought of as this complicated web, this complicated genealogy that connects earlier text to older texts, that connects texts even horizontally. So texts that are produced in a contemporary fashion to others can then also have an effect on their contemporary peers, their sister and brother texts. And this also affects fiction. So it also affects not only how certain ideas are promulgated and modified, it can also affect author's style, their particular themes, their emphases and focuses when it comes to writing and what they are interested in thematically. So intertextuality can be very important to understand. If you approach a text as though it's in a vacuum and you aren't doing so in a careful manner, it can be very easy to miss out on a lot about what the author is trying to say. This applies even to philosophy. It's very difficult to read a philosopher like Nietzsche or Immanuel Kant and not understand the Western philosophical tradition that they are inheritors of, and that they are contributing to. So without reading Plato, to fully understand Nietzsche's critique of Platonic ideas, to understand Kant's evolution of Platonic ideas, and to not read that original writer is to put oneself at a disadvantage and to create a position where, because you lack that context, you are not fully able to analyze and to comprehend fully what that writer is trying to say. So intertextuality in this respect is really important. It informs every text that is conceivable. Every text that exists has been influenced in some respect by intertextuality and by other texts, whether they are contemporary or historical. When you embark on literary analysis, it's very important to always keep in mind intertextuality and to think about how other texts influence the ones that you are analyzing. It might even behoove you to read or to expose yourself to those other texts so that you understand that relationship more carefully and you can have a more informed opinion about it. So again, intertextuality is the relationship between texts and it has a relationship to context, in that text can constitute part of the context that creates a text. Context leads to the text leads to the specific subtext. And although subtext, just for what it's worth, can be open to some degree of interpretation, subtext must always be supported by reasonable interpretations of textual evidence. So if an author says something in a supporting document, such as an essay or a journal entry that is not explicitly mentioned in the text under analysis, one can use that as evidence of the author's intent and meaning. If there is no evidence, though, either in the primary text or in the secondary documents provided by the author, then it becomes harder and harder to justify interpretations of certain subtext. With that said, I hope that this clarifies your understanding of intertextuality and gives you a deeper appreciation of how texts relate and influence one another. We'll be using this understanding to help us narrow down our understanding of literary analysis, but also analysis in general.